Well, the Australian Olympic Commission is hoping South East Queensland could be named as host of the 2032 Olympic Games as early as next year. It comes as new research reveals the rest of the country is throwing its weight behind the bid, with 2/3 of Australians saying they'd consider going to the Sunshine State to attend events. The research is part of the Courier Mail's Future Tourism campaign. Earlier, I spoke with Australian Olympic Commission President John Coates. John, thanks for your time today. Why is South East Queensland the best option for an Olympic bid?
Well, in Australia, it's the only city that climatically, or the only region that climatically could host the Games of enough size. Since Melbourne hosted the Games in 56 in November, December, Sydney in September, October, the IOC's now mandated that the Games have to be held in July, August. That can be accommodated up here in August, but we just got by with September, October in Sydney, and we certainly, you couldn't run the Games at that time in Melbourne, summer Games.
Yeah, well, definitely not Melbourne or the southeast of the country at the moment. Let's be realistic here. What is the likelihood that South East Queensland is actually going to win this bid to host the Olympics in 2032?
The IOC is also being more flexible now. It doesn't want you to build venues unless there is a venue legacy, unless there's a requirement that you need a new sporting venue. The IOC is happy to consider bids from a region. So they've already got here sporting facilities from the Sunshine Coast down to through Brisbane, down to the Gold Coast, Commonwealth Games recently, across to Toowoomba. So you've got the venues, you can connect them up not with just one village under new IOC rules, but a principal village, yes, in Brisbane, and then subsidiary villages. So it all fits. It fits. The IOC president has been here. He liked the overview. We have an outstanding reputation for hosting games, 2 Olympic Games, 3 Commonwealth Games, 4 Commonwealth Games, I think. So there's no doubt about our ability to run a big event like this, and the IOC, I think, would be very cognizant of that. And the next available one, as I say, is 2032.
So what exactly would need to be planned for? Would there need to be road, infrastructure, transport upgrades?
Yeah, there have been 2 studies done. One into the Games themselves, what existing venues are there, what are the options for where you'd put a stadium, where you'd host your different sports. There's many options in some cases, but it only works in this regional way if there is connectivity between all these venues and potentially villages, and that was the subject of a separate study that was done into the road and infrastructure requirements and rail for this region, and what would be required is the next stage is for the federal government to agree to funding that connectivity that's required. Now, that's not Games driven, it's required anyway. Up here, with the growth that's being shown in this region, it's required by 2030 in any event.
So how are those talks with the federal government going? Is it looking likely that they'll fund this?
Well, they're discussions that are taken as between the councils of South East Queensland and the Queensland government with them. They're certainly, the Games up here is certainly being considered by the federal government. The Prime Minister is an election promise, put $10 million into a bid. These days, you won't need to put that sort of money. It should go into the planning. There's an opportunity now to bid for a Games where there's no loser. But anyway, he's put $10 million up already. Discussions have been happening with the Infrastructure Minister, Alan Tudge, and so that's in the hands of government and the councils of South East Queensland.
You briefly touched on this earlier, but I guess how can you future-proof the project to make sure that the venues don't become redundant and then mothballed after the event? Yeah,
well, the IOC is telling you now that you should be using existing venues, using temporary venues, upgrading community venues so that they could be used for a Games, for a sport, and then return to their community benefit afterwards. There were venues at Camera on the Gold Coast used for a number of indoor sports that's returned to being a community sports community site and a community location for sports as well. So you don't have to build a stadium for Sydney. It was 115,000. The requirement now for games is 65,000, but that can also be a venue that might have a permanent use of 35,000, 40,000 and then be upgraded with temporary seating to accommodate an opening ceremony in athletics. That's the big one. Villages themselves generally, particularly if there's going to be 3 villages up here, they can be locked in with housing development, and developers would take them off your hands just as we did in Sydney. That's not a problem.
We know that for the city hosting these types of events, it can bring a pretty big economic boost. So what would a successful bid do for Queensland's economy?
Well, the big thing is that if the bid is tied to infrastructure funding over 11 or 12 years, you've got steady job growth and you've got economic growth over that longer period. So there's economic growth, there's job growth, and then as you're going into an Olympic Games, you've got tourism benefits. People like to come to both before and afterwards Olympic cities for conventions. They like to come as individual tourists. There's been massive tourist growth, inbound tourist growth in Japan, not all Olympic related, but in Japan since they were elected in 2013. And so there's tourist benefits as well, community benefits, getting kids more active in sport, all of those things. But economic-wise, it really runs off the back of the infrastructure funding.
All right, so when are we going to know? When will we have an answer on who will host the 2032 Games?
It's in the hands of the prospective candidates. They, if the changes go through in the next week or so, then it's up to the Queensland Government and the councils of South East Queensland to do the further studies, the economic impact studies, to have the discussions with federal governments. They could be in a position to prosecute a bid with the IOC as early as the IOC session or annual meeting just preceding the Games in Tokyo, or the year after in Athens, I think the meeting is. The Games for Los Angeles were allocated 11 years before, and 2021 will be 11 years before.
Well, we will have to wait and see, but for now, John, thank you so much for your time.